There's something getting lost in the reaction to the collapse of these latest trade negotiations between Canada and the United States. Mark Carney is the Prime Minister of Canada. His government represents us at that negotiating table, and we absolutely have to hold him accountable for what happens there. Canadians deserve to know what was offered, what was demanded, what changed in those final hours, and why he ultimately decided that the deal in front of him wasn't a deal Canada should sign. We don't have to blindly trust him. That's not how democracy works. We elected him to exercise judgment on our behalf, and that's exactly what he did. He looked at the agreement that was being negotiated and decided Canada was better off walking away than it was to accept it. Now we get to scrutinize that judgment. Pierre Poilievre also has an important role here. He's the leader of the opposition. His job is to challenge the government, ask difficult questions, and point out where he thinks the government is getting it wrong. But this is also a serious national situation, and opposition can't simply mean opposing everything because the government said it. If Carney gets something wrong, call him on it. If there's a better approach, tell us what it is. If Carney makes the right decision, say that too. Poilievre deserves credit for supporting the decision not to accept this agreement as it stood. That's constructive opposition, and we should recognize it when we see it. Carney shouldn't automatically be right because he's Prime Minister, and Poilievre shouldn't automatically be wrong because he's a leader of the opposition. Judge what they're actually saying and doing on the merits. Because here's the part I think we're forgetting. While Canadians fight amongst ourselves over whether Carney should have made this deal, whether he negotiated properly, whether he should have walked away, or whether the government handled this properly at all, we're forgetting how the hell we got here in the first place. And Canadians seem to have very short memories. Go back to Donald Trump's first presidency. Trump hated NAFTA. He called it a terrible agreement. He demanded that it be renegotiated. So we renegotiated it. In 2018, the United States reached an agreement with Mexico while Canada was still holding out on issues that mattered to us. Trump put enormous pressure on Canada. He threatened to move forward without us and put Canada under an extremely compressed deadline to get on board. Eventually, Canada agreed. And what came out of that negotiation? CUSMA, or USMCA if you're an American. Donald Trump's administration negotiated it. They signed it. He celebrated. He told everyone what a fantastic agreement it was. Then he became president again. And apparently, the agreement he demanded, negotiated, signed, and celebrated wasn't good enough anymore. Now, let me be fair about something. Countries are allowed to change their minds. Economies change, circumstances change, governments change. If the United States looked at CUSMA and decided there were things that weren't working for them, fine. That's what negotiations are for. Come to Canada and say, hey, we've got a problem. We need to talk. I've used this analogy before because I think it describes what happened remarkably well. Imagine two friends sitting on a couch watching a movie. One of them has a problem with the other guy. He has two choices. He can turn to his friend and say, hey, we've got a problem here. We need to talk. Or he can punch the guy in the head and say, we've got a problem here. We need to talk. That's essentially how this started. Now, the guy who got punched is sitting there going, what the hell was that? He's angry. He's offended. Maybe he gets up and walks away. Does that mean everything he does afterward is automatically justified? Of course not. If he reacts badly, well, that's on him. If he makes stupid decisions, we judge those decisions. But if we're trying to figure out why these two guys aren't sitting peacefully on the couch watching the movie anymore, we don't start the story after the punch. Canada didn't throw the first punch in this trade war. Remember how this started. We were told Canada was a border problem. We were told Canada was a fentanyl problem. We were essentially presented as part of an American national security emergency, even though the amount of fentanyl entering the United States from Canada was a tiny fraction of what was entering through the Mexican border. Canada responded. Then suddenly, the list started getting longer. Dairy, supply management, trade deficits, steel, aluminum, autos, Canadian regulations, taxes, the trade agreement itself. Then we started hearing about the 51st state. We heard Canada's prime minister called a governor. We were told the United States doesn't need our cars. They don't need our lumber. They don't need our energy. They really don't need anything from us. We heard the President of the United States talk about economic force while discussing Canada. And now we're somewhere else again. Mark Carney says that in the final hours of these negotiations, the Americans introduced additional demands. He says there were problems involving the treatment of Canadian automotive production, particularly medium and heavy-duty trucks. He says that the Americans introduced language that would restrict Canada's ability to enter trade agreements with other countries. He also says there were continuing attempts to interfere with Canadian protections involving our language and culture. Those are Carney's claims. We need evidence. We need the American account. We need journalists asking questions. We need Parliament asking questions. We need Pierre Poilievre asking questions. But stand back for a second and look at the trajectory. We started with fentanyl. Now we're talking about who Canada is allowed to trade with. At some point, someone has to ask the obvious question. What exactly would satisfy the United States? Because this starts to look like a relationship where every time you address one complaint, another one takes its place. Imagine a marriage counselor sitting between two people trying to save their relationship. One person says, if you just fix this, we'd be okay. So they fix it. No, actually now it's this. Okay, they deal with that. Now there's another problem. Eventually, that counselor is going to look across the room and ask whether one of these people actually intends to make this relationship work. And when I say relationship, I'm talking about a relationship between two sovereign countries, because there are different types of relationships. A master and a servant, they have a relationship too. That doesn't make it a partnership. Canada and the United States are not equal in size. We're not equal economically. We're not equal militarily. Everyone knows that. But we are two sovereign countries. America gets to pursue American interests. Canada gets to pursue Canadian interests. Sometimes those interests are going to conflict. Sometimes America's going to get more. Sometimes Canada's going to get more. Sometimes both countries compromise because maintaining the relationship itself has value. That is what a partnership looks like. But if the American definition of a successful relationship becomes, we're bigger than you, you need us more than we need you, therefore we determine the terms, that is something completely different. And that's why the way Donald Trump uses tariffs matters. The U.S. Supreme Court already rejected one of the administration's legal mechanisms for imposing its sweeping tariffs. What happened next? The administration didn't reconsider its belief in the tariffs. It went looking for another legal authority that could be used to impose them. That doesn't automatically mean every new tariff is illegal. That's for the courts to decide. But it tells us something important. The tariff isn't necessarily the response to a grievance. The tariff is a tool. The grievance provides the reason to use that tool. We've watched tariffs announced, postponed, changed, exempted, reinstated, threatened again. We've watched deadlines come and go. We've watched negotiations appear close to completion before changing direction. And now Canada is supposed to negotiate another long-term agreement in that environment. So we have to ask a very uncomfortable question. If Canada is going to make enormous permanent concessions to get another deal with Donald Trump, what exactly are we buying? 10 years of stability? 3 years? 1 year? 6 months? Maybe till Monday? That's the problem. A trade agreement isn't valuable simply because somebody signs a piece of paper. It's valuable because businesses and governments can rely on it. Companies can build factories based on rules they expect to exist years from now. Businesses establish supply chains, people make investments, and governments build infrastructure. Billions of dollars move because everyone has some reasonable expectation that tomorrow morning, the rules aren't suddenly going to be completely different. And that is what has been damaged here. It's why Canada has to maintain the ability to say no, even if that means waiting. I'm not suggesting Canada stops negotiating and sits around until Donald Trump leaves office. He's the president of the United States. They're our biggest trading partner, and we have to deal with the government that's there. But waiting has to be one of our options. Because if Washington knows Canada cannot survive without a deal right now, then we're not negotiating anymore. We're simply figuring out how long it takes before Canada eventually says yes. Waiting would hurt. Of course it would. Jobs would be lost, businesses would suffer, and investment could be delayed. The Canadian government might have to spend enormous amounts of money supporting industries and workers affected by this trade war. But we've faced national emergencies before. We've spent extraordinary amounts of money getting Canadians through extraordinary circumstances in the past. If our choice eventually becomes temporary economic pain or permanent concessions affecting Canada's economic independence, then temporary pain has to at least be an option we're prepared to consider. Because there's another part of this that doesn't disappear even when Donald Trump eventually does. Trust. Trust is incredibly easy to destroy and incredibly difficult to rebuild. Think about a marriage where someone cheats. Maybe they reconcile, maybe they stay together. Maybe they eventually become happy again. Maybe they rebuild an excellent relationship. But that relationship is never exactly the one they had before. It can't be. Because one person knows something now that they didn't know before. Canada knows something today that we didn't fully appreciate before this started. Our dependence on the United States can be used against us. And we can't unknow that. That doesn't mean Americans are our enemies. They're not. They're our neighbors. They're our friends. Our families cross the border. Our economies are deeply intertwined. Militaries, they work together. Our cultures overlap. We're going to have a relationship with the United States for as long as our two countries exist. Hopefully, it's an extraordinarily good one. But Canada should never again build its economy on the assumption that Washington would never use our dependence as leverage against us. Diversifying our trade is not anti-American. It's insurance. Building Canadian capacity is not anti-American either. It's prudent. Making sure we can survive a confrontation with an American administration isn't hostility towards Americans. It's something a sovereign country should be capable of doing. So yes, hold Mark Carney accountable. Ask him what happened. Demand evidence. Expect Pierre Poilievre to provide serious, constructive opposition and give him credit when he does. Listen to the American version of what happened as well. Keep negotiating. If there's a good deal, take it. If there isn't, walk away. And if necessary, be prepared to wait. But while we're doing all of that, for God's sake, remember how we got here. Remember the fentanyl emergency, the border accusations. Remember the tariffs. Remember the governor, the 51st state. Remember being told America doesn't need anything Canada sells. Remember the agreement we already negotiated, who demanded that agreement, whose administration negotiated, who signed it, and who celebrated it, and who came back a few years later and decided it wasn't a good deal anymore. Canada is responsible for how we handle this. Mark Carney is responsible for the decisions his government makes. Pierre Poilievre is responsible for the kind of opposition he provides. And all of us are responsible for making sure our politics don't divide this country at exactly the moment we need to be thinking clearly about what's in Canada's best interests. But Canada doesn't have to accept responsibility for starting this, because we didn't. And whatever happens next, we shouldn't allow our political arguments with each other to make us forget who threw the first punch.